So this video is going to be looking at one of the key sources linked to the topic of Sophists. So the source is written by Gorgias and is known as the Enchonium of Helen. So remember, Gorgias is one of our key Sophists, and this sort of speech stroke poem thing is basically going to talk through some different arguments about Helen of Troy. So there were different thoughts, so schools of thoughts about Helen of Troy and obviously then the Trojan War and her role in causing it. So there were some who believed that she went willingly and therefore the war was her fault, and there are others who argued that she was kidnapped and therefore the war was not her fault, and this is where this is coming from. So the whole idea of this poem stroke speech thing is to kind of talk about the different arguments and to use reason and evidence and argument to show why the different arguments are right or wrong. It's not going to come to necessarily a strong conclusion. It's just showing you the use of rhetoric and the teachings of sophists in order to form arguments that can win an overall debate. And that's where this is coming from. So you don't necessarily have to quote a lot of this particular source because it's not that quotable, to be completely honest. There is a couple of rhetoric quotes near the beginning that we can use, but in terms of the arguments he gives, there's not a lot to really pick out in terms of using in an essay. It's more about the speech as an overall thing. What I will do, which I don't do for many of these sources, is I'll read through the whole thing as we go along, because it's quite a cool source. It's a cool source, and it's quite an interesting source. It's worth having a look through properly. And obviously, there's only little bits that I've highlighted. So you'll notice it's divided into different verses, which is why it's kind of like a poem, so it's a speech thing. So the adornment of a city is manpower of a body beauty, of a soul wisdom, of an action virtue, of a speech truth, and the opposites of these make for disarray. Man and women and speech and deed and city and object should be honoured, if praiseworthy, with praise and incur, if unworthy, blame. For it is an equal error and mistake to blame the praisable and praise the blameable. It is the part of one and the same man, both to speak the needful rightly, and to refute what is said not rightly. It is fitting, then, to refute those who rebuke Helen, a woman with whom univocal and unanimous has been the ill omen of her name, which has become a memorial of misfortunes. For my part, by introducing some reasoning into my speech, I wish to free the accused from blame, and by revealing her detractors as liars and showing forth the truth, to free her from ignorance. So when I say it doesn't come to a strong conclusion, you can see there is going to be an argument that's going to be presented. But when we get to the end, you'll see what I mean about it being not a strong conclusion. I'm not leading you down the mispath. It's just the very end verse is quite interesting. So we've got a couple of bits about rhetoric we can pick out, and the idea that if you use argument in the right way, you can win a debate, which is what this is talking about, and how it's right to have these discussions and debates. So the importance of rhetoric in political life. So then there's going to be a large section where there's not really anything relevant to use of the source in essays, but it doesn't make sense without reading the whole thing. So then, that in nature and in ancestry, the woman who is subject to the speech is preeminent among preeminent men and women, it is not unclear, even to a few. For it is clear that her mother was Leda, and her father was in fact a god, Zeus, but said to be a moral. I think it's supposed to say mortal. Yes, looking at my keyboard, that should say mortal. That would make way more sense. Tyndareus, of whom the one was shown to be her father, because he was, and the latter was disproved. Because he was said to be, and the latter was the most powerful of men, while the former was lord of all things. Born of such stock, she had godlike beauty, which, taking not and not mistaking, she kept. In many did she work much desire for her love, and with her one body she brought together bodies of men, thinking great thoughts for great goals, of whom some had greatness of wealth, some the glory of ancient nobility, some the vigour of personal agility, some command of acquired knowledge. And all came because of a passion which loved to conquer, and a love of honour which was unconquered. Who it was, and why and how he sailed away, taking Helen as his love, I shall not say. It actually rhymes, that bit, and that's also talking about Paris. To tell the knowing what they know already shows the right but brings no delight. Having passed over the time then in my speech now, I shall go on to the beginning of my future speech, and I shall set forth the causes which made it likely that Helen's voyage to Troy should take place. So now he's going to set up the different arguments, basically. For either it was by the will of fate, and the wishes of the gods, and the votes of necessity, that she did what she did. So there's one argument here that it's because of the gods, basically. Or by force reduced, or by words seduced, or by love possessed. So that she was kidnapped, or she was seduced with sort of words and love. Now, if through the first it is right for the responsible to be held responsible, for God's predetermination cannot be hindered by human premeditation. That seems pretty obvious what you're saying there. For it is the nature of things, not for the stronger to be hindered by the weaker, but for the weaker to be ruled and drawn by the stronger, and for the stronger to lead and the weaker to follow. God is a stronger force than might, in might and in wit and in other ways. If then on fate and on God one must place blame, Helen from disgrace one must free. So in other words, if it is the gods, it's not her fault, because how can she overtake what the gods have told her to do? It's in her fate, it's been pre-decided. So that's one argument. So the next argument is obviously about sort of being kidnapped and what have you. But if she was by violence raped and lawlessly forced and unjustly outraged, it is plain that the rapist as the outrager did the wronging, and the raped as the outraged did the suffering. Okay, pretty obvious. It is then for the barbarian who undertook a barbaric undertaking, in word and law and deed, to meet with blame in word, exclusion in law, and punishment in deed. How would it not be reasonable for a woman raped and robbed of her country and deprived of her friends to be pitied rather than pilloried? He did the dread deeds, she suffered them. It is therefore to pity her, but to hate him. Which again makes sense as an argument, so you can sort of summarise key thoughts as we're going through this. But if it was speech which persuaded her and deceived her soul, not even to this it is difficult to make an answer and to banish blame. So now he's going on to the rhetoric argument, which is probably the most important section for us in terms of his teaching. As follows. Speech is a powerful lord, who with the finest and most invisible body achieves the most divine works. It can stop fear and banish grief, and create joy and nurture pity. I shall show how this is the case, for I must offer proof to the opinions of my hearers. I both deem and define all poetry as speech possessing metre. There come upon its hearers fearful shuddering, and tearful pity, and grievous longing, and at the great good fortunes and evil actions of others' affairs and bodies, through the agency of words, the soul experiences suffering of its own. So clearly kind of showing, here is the power of rhetoric. It can control your emotions. It can make you feel all these different things. So this is kind of like, it is an overwhelming power over everybody. But come, I shall turn from one argument to another. Sorry, I forgot to finish the sentence. Inspired incantations conveyed through words become bearers of pleasure and banishers of pain, for merging with opinion in the soul, the power of the incantation beguiles it and persuades it and alters it by witchcraft. Of witchcraft and magic twin arts have been discovered, which are the errors of the soul and deceptions of opinion. So, I didn't know why I didn't highlight that before. So we have obviously evidence here, rhetoric quite literally can like confuse you and persuade you to do things that you wouldn't normally do. All who have and do persuade people of things do so by mouldering a false argument. So rhetoric. For if all men on all subjects had both memory of things past and awareness of things present and foreknowledge of the future, speech would not be similarly similar. That was really hard to say. Since, as things are now, it is not easy for them to recall the past, nor to consider the present, nor to divine the future. So that on most subjects, most men take opinions as counsellor to their soul. But opinion, being slippery and insecure, casts those employing it into slippery and insecure successors. So obviously the point he's making here is obviously we get our information from people giving opinions and evidence, etc., and that in itself is potentially quite dangerous, cause of being a slippery and insecure. And obviously, if you haven't got the right information, you will be sort of decepted. It will be deception, better phrasing, of you and your sort of understanding of the situation. So this is kind of like the dangers of rhetoric, which obviously he's pointing out the power of rhetoric. What cause then prevents the conclusion that Helen, similarly, against her will, may have come under the influence of speech, just as if ravished by the force of pirates? For the mode of persuasion is in no way like that of necessity, but its power is the same. For the speech which persuades the soul constrain that soul which it persuades. I'm just going to highlight that sentence because it links to the one above it. Both to obey its utterances and to approve its doings. The persuader, as constrainer, does the wrong, and the persuaded, as constrained, is wrongly blamed. So clearly the rhetoric is the key to all of this. If she had been persuaded by speech, it's not her fault. She was listening to opinions, listening to evidence. She was bewitched by rhetoric, and therefore it's not Helen's fault that she went to Troy. That persuasion, when added to speech, can impress the soul as it wishes. One may learn first from the utterances of the astronomers, who, substituting opinion for opinion, taking away one but creating another, make what is incredible and unclear seem true in the eyes of opinion. So again, we have evidence about the power of rhetoric and its ability to persuade people. And second, compelling contests in words. In a single speech, written with art, but not spoken with truth, may charm and persuade a large multitude. So that could be a reference to the assembly. And third, the struggles of philosophic arguments, in which swiftness of thought is also shown. Making belief in an opinion easily changed. So we'll highlight that one. So power of rhetoric can change your opinion, even though it can change your belief, just through the power of argument. The effect of speech upon the structure of soul is as the structure of drugs over the nature of bodies. For just as different drugs dispel different secretions from the body, and some bring an end to disease and others to life, also in the case of speeches, some distress, others delight, some cause fear, others embolden their hearers, and some drub and bewitch the soul with a kind of evil persuasion. I don't think that needs any explanation. It has been stated then that, if she was persuaded by speech, she did not do wrong, but was unfortunate. The fourth cause I shall discuss in a fourth section. For it is love which did these things. No difficulty will she have in escaping the charge of the sin which is alleged to have taken place. For the things we see do not have the nature which we have to have, but the nature which each happens to have. Through sight the soul is impressed even to its core. So he's going to give a fourth argument, which is about that if she was sort of seduced by love, again, it's still not her fault, and he's going to link it back to an earlier argument as well. For example, when enemy bodies fit themselves out against enemies, with warlike gear of bronze and iron, for some defence, some for offence. If the sight sees this, it is alarmed and alarms the soul, so that often men flee in terror from present danger as if it was as if it were present. For strong as is the habit of obedience to the law, it is driven out by fear resulting from sight, from which, coming to a man, causes him to set out at naught, both the noble that is adjusted through law and the good that comes through victory. It has happened that people, having seen frightening sights, have lost pretence of mind from the present moment. Thus does fear extinguish and expel thought, and many have fallen victim to useless labour and dread disease and madness hard to cure. In this way, the sight engraves upon the mind images of things seen. Many frightening impressions linger, and what lingers is very similar to what is said. Moreover, when pictures from many colours and figures perfectly create a single figure and form, they delight the sight, while the crafting of statues and the production of artworks provide a pleasant vision to the eyes. So it is natural for the sight to be grieved by some things and to long for others, and much love and desire for many things and bodies is wrought in many people. So he's getting to the point, I promise. If therefore the eye of Helen, pleased by the body of Alexander, presented to her soul eager desire and contest of love, what is wonderful in that? If, being a god, love has the divine power of the gods, how could a lesser being reject and refuse it? But if it is a disease of human origin and a blind spot in the soul, it should not be condemned as a sin, but considered a misfortune. For she came, and as she did come, by the snares of fate, not by the counsels of reason, and by the constraints of love, not by the devices of art. How then can one regard the blame of Helen as just, seeing as whether she did what she did, by love amastered, or by speech persuaded, or by force ravished, or by divine constraint compelled, she is utter acquitted of all charge. So if she fell in love, it's not her fault, essentially, because love is like this sort of bizarre thing in the soul, and we always fall in love with things that we see because that's part of our nature. That's what that whole section was going on about. And then we come to the very end. I have through speech removed ill frame from a woman. So, power of rhetoric. I have stayed true to the procedure that I have set up, but at the outset of my speech, I have tried to end the injustice of blame and the ignorance of opinion. My purpose was to compose a speech as an encomium of Helen, so defence of Helen, brilliant, yeah, he succeeded, and an amusement for myself. So he did it just because he could. So this is, you could argue, is the issue with Sophists. It's yes, he's presented this really good argument of why it wasn't Helen's fault, what happened to Troy, but he's only done it because he can. He's not doing it because necessarily it's for the right reasons, and that is some of the criticisms that are levelled against Sophists. That yes, they were teaching the power of rhetoric, and he admits the power of rhetoric is hugely powerful, and if he was persuaded through speech, it's definitely not her fault. But he admits himself that Sophists were teaching some of this simply because they could, and that could be some of the danger of the Sophists and their influence on the Athenian democracy.